Good afternoon, everybody. It is a presentation to talk about the different material cycles that you've read in the last homework assignments. We're going to talk about how water, carbon, and nitrogen all cycle through the environment through both the non-living and living parts of it. So what are material cycles? Material cycles explain how the important elements for life, the ones that make up our organic molecules, move through the living and non-living parts of the environment. They are sometimes referred to as biogeochemical processes because they could be found in living things, that's the bio part of the word. They could be found in the ground or in the atmosphere, that refers to the geo, and they get converted from one form to another, different types of molecules through chemical processes. And the materials that we're talking about are the ones that are important for organic molecules: carbon, nitrogen, hydrogen, and oxygen. All of these are cycled by these processes. Now, we learned about energy flow through food webs and food chains. There's a few differences between material cycles and energy flow. The first is that in a material cycle, the carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen are used and reused and can move from one part of the cycle to another in various pathways. So these are all cycling around. They're not always going to follow the same pathway through a cycle, but they're all capable of moving from one part to any other part. In energy, it only travels in one direction. It starts with our producers, the photosynthesizers, and then it moves up a food chain. So the things that eat the plants, they get what they need, and then the predators that eat the herbivores, they get what they need, and eventually everything gets broken down by bacteria. So the energy is only flowing in one direction in energy flow. Another difference is that the materials are reused over and over again because there is a finite amount of these materials present on Earth. So there's no new sources of carbon that are entering into our ecosystem, no new sources of hydrogen, oxygen, or nitrogen either. So these have to be used and reused over and over again. In energy flow, the energy is not being recycled because there's always a source of new energy. The sun is providing energy all the time. So plants are not reusing energy, they're taking energy from the sun and then converting it into a form that can be used by plants and animals. The first cycle we'll talk about is probably the one you're most familiar with, which is the water cycle. And this talks about how water, H2O, is moved from the living, non-living parts of the environment, from oceans to mountains to under the ground. So in water cycles, all three phases of matter, liquid, gas, and ice, solids, are represented. The processes by which this occurs are evaporation, is when you go from a liquid to gaseous forms of water; transpiration, which is water vapor that's released from plants because plants are carrying out respiration. Excess water is released by the plants as water vapor; sublimation, the process by which solid water skips the liquid phase altogether and becomes water vapor; freezing, turning liquid water into a solid; melting, turning solid water, ice, into liquid water; and condensation, where water vapor changes back into a liquid. And you can see here in this diagram, this is a fairly simple diagram of the water cycle. The arrow is showing you the direction the water is moving and the way that it is moving. There are many different pathways a molecule of water can travel through the water cycle. Sometimes it's just going to fall as rain right into an ocean and then be evaporated back up into the clouds. It's going to condense and then form right back into the water. So some are simpler than others. But let's start the process with something that you're very familiar with. We'll start with yourself. As a living thing, you are a part of all of these cycles that we're going to be talking about. So, say it's a hot sunny day and you've been outside exercising. And as you exercise, you start to heat up, so your body will begin to sweat in order to cool you down. When you sweat, the water in your sweat will evaporate into water vapor, and as it does, it takes a little bit of heat energy from it, so you feel cooler. So this is evaporation. The sweat is evaporating off the surface of your skin and going from liquid water into water vapor. The water vapor is now in the atmosphere. And as this water vapor rises up through the atmosphere, it gets cooler because as we get higher up into the atmosphere, it starts to get colder. Eventually, it's going to reach what is called the dew point. The dew point temperature is where the water vapor will condense into tiny droplets of water and form clouds. So condensation is the process of vapor becoming a liquid. Most clouds are so far up in the atmosphere that the temperature is below the freezing point, and the water droplets will become tiny little particles of ice. As more and more water vapor accumulates in the cloud, it gets too heavy. There's too much liquid water and ice up there to remain in the atmosphere, so it falls down to the earth as either rain, snow, sleet, or hail. Collectively, we call this precipitation. The precipitation will fall and land in bodies of water, or it will hit the surface of the land. When it hits the surface of the land, some of this water will run off along the surface and into streams, rivers, or other bodies of water, reservoirs, the oceans, lakes. Some of the water will land in soil where it can percolate or sink down into the soil until eventually it reaches the water table. The water table is an underground reservoir of water that sits above the bedrock, so the water cannot go any further down and it builds up under the soil. Water that falls as snow may remain in a solid state, sometimes for centuries if it's up high in the mountains or in Antarctica. But most of the time, seasonally, it will become warm enough and it will melt. And that water will then run off into streams and rivers, or it will percolate down into the soil. Or on sunny days, the water, the ice can sublimate right back into a vapor. So it goes directly from a solid to a gas without going through the liquid phase. That's the process known as sublimation. The water can now be used by plants and animals, including humans like you. So as you drink water to cool off from your exercising, that water has either been pumped out of a well or it's been delivered to you through pipes from a reservoir. So the water is now back where it started from. It's back in your body, and that completes one cycle of the water cycle. In the video that they showed in CK12, they show other examples. I'll put some other videos of these different cycles at on the Google Classroom page so you can check those out too to see other ways that water can move through a water cycle. The next cycle we're going to talk about is the carbon cycle. Now, you recall from when we did the organic molecules, carbon is the most important element for organic life. Without it, we cannot form the molecules that are complex enough to carry out all the life processes. The carbon in the atmosphere is in the form of carbon dioxide gas. Plants take up this carbon dioxide during the process of photosynthesis. And in addition to creating oxygen that we need, they also use the carbon to create carbohydrates and other organic molecules. Animals that eat plants get this carbon-rich material as they eat the plant, and these herbivores get eaten by predators in turn higher up the food chain. So this carbon is moving up the food chain in the organic molecules. At every point in a food chain, organisms are using some of this carbon to carry out the process of respiration. During respiration, CO2 gas is released back into the atmosphere. So photosynthesis and respiration are how carbon dioxide is being recycled in the atmosphere. But there's other ways for carbon to move around. During the process of combustion, which is burning, CO2 is released back into the atmosphere. When we burn wood or fossil fuels, humans are releasing carbon back into the atmosphere. Both wood and fossil fuels are carbon-rich molecules. The fossil fuels themselves are the fossilized remains of ancient plants that became compacted and buried under the surface before they could be decomposed by bacteria or fungi. If these are being broken down by bacteria or fungi, they're carrying out respiration, and that carbon would be released as carbon dioxide. But the fossil fuels never had a chance for that to happen. So they're very rich carbon molecules that have been buried and compacted under the ground. And when we burn them, we're releasing the CO2 back into the atmosphere. Our dependence on fossil fuels and the heavy use that we have of them is increasing the amount of atmospheric CO2, which can in turn lead to an increased greenhouse effect on Earth, which can affect the temperature. Because of this, research into alternate forms of energy that do not release carbon dioxide is an important and ongoing quest. So we're doing this all the time, finding different ways to get the energy that we need. Fossil fuels being eliminated, we could use wind power, solar power, hydroelectric power. Anything that's not involving combustion is going to reduce the amount of carbon dioxide we're putting into the atmosphere, and that's a good thing. Other sources of carbon dioxide are natural processes. So it's not just the burning of fossil fuels and respiration that's putting CO2 into the atmosphere. Volcanoes and forest fires both release CO2 into the environment. When a volcano erupts, amongst other gases are CO2. And this CO2, a lot of it can be released all at once. And burning forest fires is just combustion. Just like when we burn wood, CO2 will be released during the process of burning that material. Limestone is a type of organic sedimentary rock. It's made up of the shells of things like clams and other bivalves, so it contains a lot of carbon. When it gets rained upon, there's a slight acidity to the rain that we learned about when we did acid and bases. This breaks down the limestone and releases CO2 both into the atmosphere and into bodies of water. So that's the carbon cycle. And last but not least is the nitrogen cycle. Nitrogen is an extremely important element for some of the organic molecules that we learned about. We drew amino acids on the board lots of times, and we know that they all contain nitrogen. We worked with nucleic acids like DNA. We looked at the structure of those, and they also contain nitrogen. So nitrogen is very important. Without nitrogen, we couldn't build these types of molecules. Now, nitrogen isn't a scarce or rare material. In fact, it is the biggest part of our atmosphere. 78% of the atmosphere is nitrogen, and that's nitrogen in the form of a gas. Now, plants and animals both need nitrogen, but we can't use nitrogen in its gaseous form, which is N2. It's a diatomic molecule, so there's two molecules of nitrogen held together by three different covalent bonds. So these molecules are very, very tightly bound to each other. So it's not easy to break these bonds, and plants and animals have not figured out a way to do this. But fortunately, we don't need to because of bacteria. There are certain types of bacteria that are vitally important in the nitrogen cycle. The only organisms that can convert nitrogen gas from the environment into a usable form are a special class of bacteria called nitrogen-fixing bacteria. These bacteria live in the soil and also in special structures in the roots of certain plants called legumes that are called nodules. So these bacteria are able to take the nitrogen as nitrogen gas and convert it into a class of molecule called nitrates. Nitrates can be used by plants. If ever you get fertilizer for your garden, you'll see if you look at what's inside of them, nitrates are going to be one of the big ingredients because they help the plants to grow. These nitrogen-containing compounds, these nitrates, are used by the plants. They use them to build structures like proteins and other structures like the cellulose in their cell walls. And this gets eaten by organisms and passed up the food chain. So the nitrogen that we have for our proteins comes from the food that we eat. When plants and animals die, they are usually decomposed by certain bacteria. These bacteria convert the nitrogen in the molecules of dead plants and animals into ammonium ions. This process is called ammonification. Then other bacteria convert the ammonium ions into nitrates and nitrites through the process of nitrification. The nitrites will be used by the plants, and the nitrates and the rest of the stuff will get broken down by another type of bacteria back into nitrogen gas. And this is a process called denitrification. So ammonification, nitrification, and denitrification are all parts of the nitrogen cycle that are occurring because of bacteria. And that completes the nitrogen cycle. So, in summary, these biogeochemical processes are cycling the important building blocks of life. Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen are finite, so they need to be recycled. These elements are used and reused and move through one type of molecule to another through various chemical processes. And without the recycling of materials, life on Earth could not exist. There isn't a source of new carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. There are only so much of these elements present, and they get reused over and over again. So the oxygen that you're breathing in right now has been used innumerable times by other types of life, other people, other animals, other plants. Same with the carbon, the hydrogen, and the nitrogen. They're all used temporarily by living things, and then they pass back into the cycle and are used by other things over and over again. All right, so I'm going to attach with this YouTube video other shorter videos that will go over these cycles. If you refer back to the CK12 sections that covered these cycles, they also have embedded videos that hopefully you've already watched. And I hope that after this, you have a better understanding of how these important organic molecules are cycled through the living and non-living parts of the environment.